Hi there! Now let me bring these trains to a stop and cut down some of the noise here. So we can talk. Well, welcome back to the Ashtabula Valley Railway and the Phase 2 edition of this layout build. Not this layout, but Chuck's layout. So recently I loaded up my truck with a bunch of all sorts of tools that we would need, along with obviously the pre-assembled legs that I had shown in the Phase 1 edition video, and I made my trip to Chuck's place. And once we got there, or once I got there, I should say, not we, once I got there, it didn't take us too long to get everything unloaded. And once everything was unloaded, you know, he then gave me a little bit of a tour, even though I had been to his house many times before. But this time, his train room was just like empty, you know, because his old layout was now completely torn down. The only thing basically that was left in the room was a stack of 2x4s that was left over that he salvaged from his previous layout. Now, normally in this build we would be using a lot of some 1x4s, but because we're wanting to recycle as much of the previous lumber from his previous layout, which was all 2x4s, we're going to be using, in place of 1x4s, we're going to be using 2x4s instead. The cost of lumber these days, it makes sense to just recycle as much as we possibly can. So, anyways, I've always enjoyed going to his place. We always have some good laughs and a good time. But now it's time to get started. And after a little bit of a discussion, we decided we needed to get some other 8-foot 2x4s because all the 2x4s that he had been cut off to some oddball length of whatever, but we needed some 8-footers. So we got in my truck, we headed to the lumber yard, gathered up what we needed, which wasn't much. I think we only bought, I think it was like 8 2x4s, something like that, and got back to his place. And at that point, it was kind of like disaster somewhat struck. It was like 4:30 in the afternoon at this point, and as I started to unload the 2x4s, yours truly accidentally let the dog get out. And of course the dog decided he was going to play a little game called "Nah, nah, you can't catch me," and every time you get near him, he'd take off and run in one direction. So Chuck wasn't too happy. I felt really bad about it, and Chuck, please believe me, I deeply apologize for letting that happen. But for the next couple hours, we ended up chasing this dog throughout the entire neighborhood and walking through people's yards and people asking, what are you doing here? And yada. It was like, it was just crazy. And finally we did catch up with the dog. We got him back home safely. No issues came up, no injuries. Nobody got hurt in any way, other than my pride for letting this situation happen. But anyways, at this point it was like, now we can finally get started at getting this project underway. So take a look at the rest of this. And unfortunately I did not get any video coverage of the actual build itself. We were stressed for time. We only had a 2-day weekend. We did have a 3-day weekend for July 4th planned, but unfortunately those plans kind of fell through as things came up and just interrupted that schedule. So we ended up rescheduling on a 2-day weekend, and we knew we had a lot of work to do. It's like we can pause to take a quick photo here and there, but setting up the video camera and having to deal with that was just going to be a little bit too much. So this is basically a pictorial explanation of showing just what we did, how we did it, and the progression of things as we got them completed. So let's take a look at this and see how things went.
As you can see in this first photo, we had already gotten the first few sections of leg framework put together. The section in the foreground shows the pre-assembled legs with 2x4s already attached to the sides of the legs. From here we will be attaching another 2x4 laying flatwise on top of the other 2x4s. Normally I would be using a 1x4 for this, but because of the price of lumber these days, we wanted to recycle as much of the old lumber from his original layout. This 2x4 laying flat on top will now provide a ledge for us to be able to attach the upper framework for the plywood, as you will see later. Once the first section of legs were assembled, we then built the upper framework for the plywood for this section, so that we would have somewhat of a table upon which to work from to build the other sections. In this next photo, you find me double checking the dimensions for the next plywood section to be built while Chuck was busy cutting those pieces. Here we see Chuck hard at work assembling the next plywood framework, and got that secured in place and called it a night on that Friday. On Saturday morning, we took some time off to head to Brady's Trains for a tent sale. Once we got back, we got started on the leg framing for the section on the left side of the room, and you could see in the background that we also started assembly of the plywood framing for this section and got it installed. From here, we assembled another section of legs and started cutting and assembling the pieces for the next plywood section to get that set into place. As you can see, things were really starting to take shape. From the look on Chuck's face, you can easily tell that he, as well as myself, were getting rather tired and worn out, and this was only about mid-afternoon on Saturday. At this point, we decided to build the rest of the plywood framing for the rest of the leg sections up to this point, and then called it a night, as we were both pretty tired from a long day. On Sunday morning, we finished up the last section of the leg framing and also completed the last plywood framing as well. Then we moved on to getting as much plywood in place as we possibly could before calling it a day, since I still had a long drive to get home and Chuck needed to prepare for work the next day.
Now, there is one thing I did fail to mention after reviewing this entire video. At the beginning, I did make mention that I was going to explain about the cantilever and so on. So imagine, if you will, most people, if they're building, let's say, just a 4x8 layout on a 4x8 sheet of plywood, the first instinct that they have is they're going to build the upper framework for the plywood, and then they're going to add the 4 legs to it. But where do they place those 4 legs? They place those 4 legs on the extreme outer corners, which, you know, may be okay. If that's what you want to do, then by all means do whatever you want to do. But I have a problem with it. And that problem is that when you put the legs all the way out to the outside corners, that puts all of the weight of that table, your trains, your accessories, and everything else right there in the middle. And so what happens is your table ends up over time. It's not going to happen right away. And, you know, it may not happen for a year or so. It may take a few years. But eventually, it's going to sag in the middle. So what I like to do is I like to take those legs, instead of having them in the outside corners, I like to bring them in 12 to 15 inches. You might be wondering, well, why do that? Well, by doing so, you're alleviating some of the load in the center of the table, and you're adding load to the outside edges. So the outer part that's hanging out beyond where your legs are is now acting as somewhat of a counterbalance, okay? Which means that your table will be less likely to sag on you, okay? It's likewise if you build 2 4x8 tables, you put all of the legs to the outside corners of each table, but you butt those tables together end to end, let's say, to make a 4-foot by 16-foot table. By having your legs at the outer corners, what happens here at the seam? If each table sags in the middle, you come up and right there at the joint, you got a peak. And when your track comes over that, your track is going to have that peak as well. That's cause for derailment. By bringing those legs in, that 12 to 15 inches from the ends, helps counterbalance everything on both tables to eliminate this peak and the sag that's in the middle. Laying your track is very important. You want to keep your track as smooth and consistent as possible. Wherever you have a joint in your track, you want it to be as flat and level as possible. And by helping to eliminate a problem right there, starts with your bench work. If your bench work will provide you with better stability as far as the table sagging in any ways, then the less likelihood of having a sag or a kink at a peak where the 2 tables come together, and because now your train has to come up and then it's going to drop down. That looks terrible on a video to do something like that. Okay, it looks absolutely terrible. So to avoid that, bring those legs in a little bit. The other thing I'd like to mention is that in the very first photo, I showed the leg framework there where we had attached 2x4s to the sides of the legs. We still continued to do that. That was a part of the original plan, having 2x4s there. But on top of the 2x4, we laid, normally the plan was to use a 1x4 laid on top of it so that you had this overhang out here, okay, in which you could drive a screw up in to the framework of your plywood. We also, on the cantilever part of it, we not only brought the legs in from the ends, we kept them in on the narrow side as well for the same reason. We didn't bring them in as much. We only brought them in about 6 inches. But that also helps keep, as you'll notice here on my layout, my legs are set back quite a bit from the front edge of the layout. I can come up here and be standing here and I don't have to worry about my toes or my feet accidentally bumping into the legs and so on. So it helps save your visitors from banging their toes and their feet against the legs of your table. So, but by using that 2x4 and the 1x4 on top of it, in our case we put a 2x4 up there because we wanted to, as I mentioned before, we wanted to recycle as much lumber as possible. So we used the 2x4 up there. We also used 2x4s for the plywood framework as well. Normally that would be 1x4s, help reduce the weight. But because of the cost of lumber these days and the amount of material that he had left over that he had salvaged from his old layout, we wanted to recycle as much of that as possible. That's why we use 2x4s for the framework. But if you're starting with a brand new layout and don't have a bunch of recycled lumber to have to use up, most definitely go with the 1x4s for your plywood framework. And this entire frame system is what they call an L-girder system, where you have that 2x4 that's standing upright, your plywood or your 1x4 on top. That forms what they call an L-girder that goes underneath there, and then all of your 2x4s, or I'm sorry, your 1x4s for your plywood framework stretch across all of that and supports everything. You don't have to sit back and measure all kinds of fun stuff to try, oh, this isn't quite square. If it's slightly out, don't worry about it. As long as your plywood sections are square to each other, that's all that really counts. Okay? But I just wanted to explain that much so that because some people may not have understood what was going on, and I know I did not mention a lot of this information in the previous sections of this video. So hopefully this will help out with anybody who's interested in building their benchwork. Well, by the end of that weekend, our lower backs and our feet were certainly feeling the strain of this build. And of course, chasing after the dog Friday night certainly didn't help matters much either. But we managed to survive and got the framework completed. We got most of the plywood installed. And overall, we both felt that we got a tremendous amount of work done, considering we only had a couple days time to get this work completed. And we did have a few setbacks along the way, but fortunately I had brought my computer with me that had all of the drawings on there so that I could, we did have to get out my computer, get it fired up to try to resolve the issues, and we're able to get things taken care of fairly quickly. So, but it's like on the following weekend, Chuck was able to complete the rest of the plywood, because like I said, we got most of the plywood done, but there was still that little few, as you saw in the photos, there were still a few sections of plywood that needed to be completed yet. But the following weekend, Chuck was able to get that taken care of. At this point, Chuck had made a couple of minor modifications, which he did a very excellent job at doing so. And it's now going to be up to him to begin laying the track and getting things ready on that aspect of it, which will be actually technically, that would be like the phase 3 portion of the build. It'd be laying the track. So, and then while he is doing that, I'm going to be here at home. I'm going to be building the control panels. So there's going to be 3 control panels in total. Be building the control panels for his layout and pre-wiring them. So I'll have terminal strips on the back side of them. So all the controls, as you might see like on here, on my control panel here, his control panel won't be anywhere near this size, but similar in, somewhat in design. We'll have the controls on here, the toggle switches, the controls for the the track switches and so on, along with a track diagram for that particular portion that those panels will be controlling. So, you know, I've got my work cut out for me, and all of that stuff, all of these controls will be hooked up to terminal strips on the back side, and so that once I get this project completed with the panels, we will then take and get things scheduled at some point in time to where we can get together again. I'll bring the control panels down there, we'll get them installed, and then we can begin wiring up his track from there. So stay tuned for phase 3, the laying of the track, and for phase 4, the building and wiring of the control panels. So if you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe, and even ring that bell to get further updates on this layout build. So stay tuned, and we'll see you all next time, and happy railroading.